And we start with the lecture, Decolonizing Science in Tropical Marine Research and Conservation, given by Dr. Wilfredo Liquanan. Dr. Wilfredo Liquanan holds a PhD in biology, biological sciences from the University of Southern California. Currently, he is a full professor at the De La Salle University, Manila. He is also an academy fellow at the California Academy of Sciences, San Francisco, and his expertise focuses on marine biodiversity and ecology, molecular phylogenetics, and ecology. But before passing the floor to Dr. Liquanan, I would like to ask to all the participants to maintain their microphones closed in order to enhance the quality of the sessions, and if possible, add your country after or before your name in parentheses. And there will be space for questions in the end of each session, ordered in the chat. And these questions will be addressed verbally by each participant according to each moderator's leading. In this case, it will be in a first come, first served basis. Okay, thank you very much. And Professor Liquanan, the floor is all yours.
Okay, hi everyone. I will turn off my video just in case the bandwidth becomes limited. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for attending my presentation on decolonizing science in tropical marine research and conservation. As was mentioned, my name is Wilfredo, but everybody calls me by my nickname, Al, and I'm a coral reef scientist from the Philippines. So the presentation has three parts. I will start by providing you some background information about my country to allow you to better appreciate our challenges with paraqued science or colonial science. Then I will show you some numbers about this problem with regards to coral reef research and conservation. And I will end with some recommendations about how we can decolonize this area of study. The main source for my presentation is a correspondence that we published last year in the journal Current Biology. It is an open access article if you are interested in some of the details. So let me start with the background of the Philippines. So the Philippines is made up of more than 7,000 islands. It is located in Southeast Asia, between China on the northwest and Australia on the southeast. We are also just north of Indonesia. The Philippines was named after a king of Spain. So Spain was the first country to colonize the Philippines. So because there's so many islands in the Philippines, like I said, over 7,000 of them, this plus the terrain means there's over 180 ethnic and indigenous groups in the country. These groups are often defined by distinct languages and not just dialects. And so there's over 120 languages spoken in the Philippines. Interestingly enough, some of our words actually got incorporated into the English language. Two examples are boonies or boondocks for mountains, and cutis, or kuto for lice. Okay, anyway, so the Philippines compared to Brazil. So here's a map of Brazil superimposed on the Philippines, which is 28 times smaller, ignoring the differences in land area. Our tropical rainforests are not too different from those of the Amazon in terms of number of species, or what ecologists refer to as species richness. So our rainforests, although there's not a lot left, are also very rich. The Philippines and Brazil are listed as two of the 17 so-called mega diverse countries, which includes China, Australia, and two of our neighboring countries, Indonesia and Malaysia. This is something that might be interesting to some. This is 5 slides showing how the Philippines was assembled over several million years. So in the oval in the center of the screen is the Philippines now. The shading, the color, represents where sets of islands came from. So the islands in yellow and the land formations in yellow, that's mainland Asia in origin. The areas in red are Australian, and the islands in green essentially surfaced from the bottom of the sea. And so over like 20 million years, 15 million years, 10 million years, 5 million years, and the present, the Philippines was assembled from different sources. And this is believed to be one of the reasons why there's a great diversity of organisms, why there's so many species. So in this diagram, we're showing shallow coastal areas, mostly coral reefs. The areas shaded in red, dark red, means there's over 3,000 species of corals, of seagrass, of mangroves, of clams, shrimps, snails. And you can see that the number of species in the Philippines is really high. We have more species of coral than even the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, which has about 100 less species of coral. Hawaii has around 18 species of coral. The whole of the Caribbean has only about 50 species of coral. The Philippines has over 600 species of coral. And this is one reason there's a lot of scientists from all over the world studying our coral reefs. Coral reefs are very important to the Philippines because, for one, most of our fish supply, food, comes from coral reefs. So even fishes that normally live in deep open waters, when they're younger, they live on the reef. Okay, I'm showing a video from one of our best managed reefs in the Philippines, and you can see there's so many of them that they cast a shadow over the corals in the reef. Coral reefs are also very important to our islands because they protect the shoreline from big waves. And big waves is always a problem in the Philippines because we, for one, have around 20 typhoons passing through every year, and they create storm surges. And because the area is very geologically active, including volcanoes, we get tsunamis. And many scientists rank the Philippines as the most disaster-prone country in the world because of typhoons, volcanoes, earthquakes, and the like. Unfortunately, the reefs of the Philippines are mostly at risk. Over 90% are likely to be lost in the next few decades. This article is from a recent issue of the National Geographic, and it's a very visually striking article about the richness of our reefs and the problems that they face. So as last slide of my background information, the science that's needed to guide conservation in the Philippines is just now beginning to catch up. The science is somewhat underdeveloped because of our colonial history. So just again, as a background, we've been ruled by the Spanish for over 300 years. The capital of Manila was occupied briefly by the British. Then it's 48 years of American rule, interrupted near the end by Japanese occupation. And as a consequence of this colonial history, just in terms of science, scientific research, education, 3 of the top 4 universities in the country are run by Catholic orders. The oldest is the University of Santo Tomas, and as you can see by its full name, the Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas. It is one of the universities run by Catholic orders. The top university is a state university, the University of the Philippines, or UP. It was established in 1908 during the American colonial period, and the Americans set it up to train government officials. And in certain fields of expertise, it is up to now dominated by UP graduates. For example, we have this designation accorded by the Philippine government. We have national scientists, 42 of them, and 40 of them got their advanced degrees from American universities, and almost all of them started in the University of the Philippines. So it points out the legacy of our colonial history and the consequences of that. And so let's jump into this topic of parakeet science, also known as helicopter science or colonial science. So we define parakeet science as the practice whereby international scientists, typically from higher income countries, conduct field studies in another country like the Philippines, typically lower income, typically former colonies. They complete their research in their home countries without any further effective communication and engagement from others, especially those in the nation where they collected the field data. It is a problem because it creates a dependency on external expertise. It does not address our local research needs, and it hinders local research efforts. Why is that? Well, for one, the dependency is created because such engagement it does not last long enough in order for talent in the lower income country to be developed. So the parakeet scientists do not stay around long enough or continue their engagement even when they return to their home countries. They do not engage with local students or collaborate with local scientists. Their research products are often not available to us. Very few libraries can afford the subscriptions to the journals where their work is published. And because, again, they do not stay long enough in our countries or in countries like ours, they are not able to engage with government, with conservation organizations, so that their findings are put to use in improving policy, in improving management responses. And then the reason parakeet science hinders local research efforts is because the research in the lower income countries is often preempted. You try and study something and you're just getting started, and somebody comes in with more resources, and pretty soon somebody's already publishing research that we in the lower income country is just beginning, and things like that. And I'll give you more examples. The research priorities of these parakeet scientists are not the ones that we need. And so they even are able to divert resources into research that is less useful to us in the lower income country. Our paper focused on coral reef biodiversity research, so my area of expertise. In this slide, we're looking at the number of publications in this field of study. If you look closely at the top 10 in terms of publications on coral reef biodiversity, you'll see that some of those countries, 2 of them, don't even have coral reefs in their exclusive economic zones. So clearly that research on coral reefs is being done in other countries, likely lower income. Okay, so number 1 in terms of publications is the US. They have reefs in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. Australia has the Great Barrier Reef. There are coral reefs in some of the territories controlled by the United Kingdom and France, but I don't think Germany has reefs, and neither has Canada. In this chart, we're showing which countries have the most coral reefs. And number one is Indonesia. Indonesia has 10,000 islands, and it has the most in terms of coral reef area. Most people think of Australia, but Indonesia actually has more reefs than Australia. Australia is number two. The Philippines, where I'm from, is number three in terms of reef area. But as you noticed in the last slide, Australia and Indonesia is in the top 10 in terms of publications, but not the Philippines. Okay, if you look closely at these publications, we found that there's like 40% of the publications about coral reef biodiversity that are based on studies done in the Philippines and Indonesia, number one and number three in terms of reef area. 40% of those publications do not even have a host nation scientist. So the papers, the studies are done by people who are not from these countries. And only about 10 to 25% of these publications actually list a permit number. And it's very difficult to get these permits, particularly in Indonesia and the Philippines. And yet these studies get done and these studies get published. In fairness, there's improvement in the past decade or so. Notice that the number of publications coming from Indonesia has increased quite a bit. This is because of a change in government policy that provided incentives to university faculty to publish. You will also notice that there's a good number of papers in the recent years where the authors are all from the host nation or are at least the senior author. There's not that much increase in the Philippines, but if you look closely at the trends, you'll notice that for the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, there were no Filipino scientists getting their work published except for 2 years. But because of increases in funding, changes in government priorities, like in 2020, all the authors in the publications are from the host nation, but of course, notice the number of publications is still pretty low. Unfortunately, and that's why that fact that there's not a lot of publications, over that period that I was showing, was also about the same time that there's been massive decline in the condition of our coral reefs. Coral reef health is assessed on the basis of how much coral is covering the reef, living coral. And in the last century, about 5% of our reefs are in the so-called excellent category. That means more than 3/4 of the surface of the reef is covered by coral. And when we did reassessment of reefs from 2014 to 2017, we found that there are no more excellent category reefs. And in fact, we show evidence that we lost 1/3 of our coral cover. 1/3 of the coral cover was lost in at least the last decade. So the Philippine reefs are in rapid decline, and there's not enough science to guide policy, to guide conservation priorities. And whatever science is being done by outsiders, and that work is not helping us a whole lot, even if we are able to access that work. I'll talk about specific examples. I mentioned that one of the problems with paraqued science is the work and is misdirected. So because of the decline of our reefs, there's a lot of well-meaning people out there, both in the Philippines and outside, and they try to help. But those resources are being wasted on the wrong things. There's an unusual amount of resources being devoted to so-called coral propagation, and the introduction of these so-called artificial habitats, formerly known as artificial reefs. So if the reef is dying, put concrete in its place, which is what artificial habitats are supposed to be about. But if you remind people that when we talk about the coral reef, we're talking about a huge structure, it's obvious that you cannot replace that huge structure with concrete, not cheaply anyway. So I'm showing on the screen a photograph of a reef. The photograph was taken by attaching an action camera to a kite and pulling it behind an outrigger boat. So you can see the boat from the lower part of the screen. You can see a rope stretching to the kite where the camera was attached. So in a way, the boat took a selfie. And you can see how large the reef is. And we have 25,000 square kilometers of reefs in the Philippines. And there is no way you can propagate enough corals and put enough concrete to replace those reefs. And so this is an example of misdirection. Huge amounts of resources are being spent putting structures like this and attaching corals to them. You have to wonder, where did the corals that they attached come from? I'll show you later. There are technologies like this being introduced. The idea is you put a wire mesh, you introduce a weak electrical current, and somehow it's supposed to make the corals grow faster. It does, but what you gain because of that electricity, you lose when the electricity runs out or is cut off. And it doesn't work for giant clams like this. And yet they attach giant clams to these grids. And these are expensive efforts. This one is being tried a lot all over the country. It's being used to lure tourists to Philippine reefs. So the resorts use this as a come on. You go to the Philippines, you help save the reefs by finding these fragments of coral that will die anyway, and so might as well rescue them, grow them in nurseries, and stick them back into the reef. Okay, but that's really a bad idea. And we have published papers pointing this out. For example, one reason this is a bad idea is because the reasons behind the loss of the corals to begin with are still there. So you're introducing corals to a damaged reef, but you have not done anything about why the reef was damaged to begin with. The other and a big source of damage is mining and road construction. And so imagine who's building the roads, government, and those same roads create the sedimentation problem that smothers our reefs. And so why plant so-called plant corals on the reef when the reason the original corals died to begin with are still there? We also showed that there's not enough fragments out there. We actually counted how many of these so-called fragments of opportunity there are. So the idea is you find these broken coral that will die anyway, and so might as well rescue them and plant them in a reef that you're trying to repair. But we show from actual studies around the country that to fix a hectare of reef, you need to collect fragments from 6 to 47 hectares of a healthy reef. Okay. And so to fix 1 hectare, you have to mess with and potentially damage 47 hectares. Does not make sense at all. I pointed out in an earlier slide that our reefs are known for large numbers of species, and I gave some numbers about number of species of coral. But in these nurseries where they supposed to be propagate corals, notice you're looking at a handful of species and you're putting them into a reef that in its healthy state would have more than 600 species of coral. You're propagating only a few corals, and these few corals are very sensitive, and the effort, like I said, is very, very expensive. You are better off putting the money in managing marine protected areas. Just leave the reef alone, let it heal itself, remove the stressors that damage the reef, and you will get more for the money. We've had efforts, initially government funded, where they tried this technology and the ocean heated up and 95% of the corals were wiped out. So that's why we shouldn't be applying these technologies. And if you're wondering how did these things get started? You'll be surprised. Many well-meaning people will see a YouTube video from a research project in Florida, and the next thing you know, they're trying it on our coral reefs. The size of the economies of the countries involved, the variety of corals in the reefs of those countries are very different. And you do not apply these things blindly in reefs like ours. This is the latest. And again, people are trying this because there's a YouTube video from a university in Florida. And again, we show that you should be putting the resources on other things. Unfortunately, even now in parts of the Philippines, you will likely be, a scientist will be more likely listened to if that scientist is a foreigner, as opposed to a local scientist. And in other parts of the country, people get surprised that there are Filipino coral reef scientists. And so sometimes it's frustrating to be not listened to in your own country. That's a legacy of paraqued science, colonial science. It's not all doom and gloom. There are success stories. And I just highlighted some horror stories. I should mention one other source of this misdirection are Peace Corps volunteers. Yeah, enough said. So let's talk about what can we do about it. Okay, we need to try, and there is movement in this direction, for a research culture that's more ethical, more equitable, where there are partnerships, where there's knowledge exchange, there's mutual trust, there's long-term engagement, and that will go a long way in helping the Philippines manage the reefs in its waters. For example, and there are examples, good ones, there should be joint funding with NOS. In the last few years, the Fulbright program, for example, some of the scholars are actually being financed by the Philippine government, particularly for PhD studies. There's a need for research that is set up from the start to have counterpart funding. Typically, for example, funding from the new U.S. National Science Foundation, the grantees are prohibited from using those funds in helping foreign nationals with their research. And so for collaborative research to take off, there is a need for counterpart funding. Policy needs to be improved. We need to be able to measure this problem of paraqued science better, recognize where it exists, where it can be useful, where it is not, and figure out both long-term and short-term interest and how to balance them. If I may give a specific example, I mentioned earlier that it's very difficult to get the research permits, or more so collection permits, to study reefs in Indonesia and the Philippines. And in the Philippines, one reason those permits are very difficult to get is because of many bad experiences with foreign scientists doing what's referred to as bioprospecting, looking for potentially new products in the natural substances produced by these organisms. Unfortunately, these well-meaning regulations to make the collection permits difficult to get are hurting the local scientists more than the foreign scientists that are supposed to be regulated. And so this is why this suggestion about improvements in policy and government regulations. We also recommend that the journal editors be more careful about manuscripts that are clearly examples of paraqued science, and I have personal experience with this, and it's really frustrating. The journals should require permit numbers, research ethics clearances, and clear permissions from the host countries. This is a recent example, study on migrations of people, very useful, involved a lot of people, both Filipino and foreign. They mention that this was done above board, but a few months later, we get statements from government entities pointing out that no, this is not supposed to happen. If you are interested in doing this kind of work in other countries, we suggest you really go out and make an effort to find collaborators, work with our local funding agencies so that your collaborators have counterpart funding, develop research agendas, train the next generation, make literature available, and make sure you know all the laws, because even your collaborator may not. And for our part, we need to make sure that we can turn this problem around and make it useful for us and the systems that we're trying to protect. So that's it. Thank you for listening. I think there's still enough time for questions or comments if you have one. Again, thank you and good day.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Liquanan, for this encompassing lecture and the discussion about the need for a more ethical and equitable approach to the global research culture, and the importance to define these metrics and the boundaries to create long-term research relationships. Thank you very much. And here we have quite a few questions, and I would like to call each one of the participants to address them personally to you. So I'm going to start here with Elvis Tinashe Ganda. Can you please open your phone, your microphone, and your video, and tell us about your country? Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I'm Elvis. I'm from Zimbabwe, but I'm based in Italy at the moment. So I wanted some of the things that I wanted to ask Professor Liquanan, address them in the recommendation. But now I'm going to restructure and say, how have you engaged the government on the recommendations and what has been the response? Because the questions were related to how we can leverage parachute scientists to engage with local communities, and also how we can make sure that the journals are also aware of the contributions of local scientists and peer reviews. But now, since you have addressed that in your recommendations, have you engaged with the government, and what was their response, or what is the way forward? Because the government is, at the end of the day, the arbitrators of the policies that we must use.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank
you for the question. I can give you two examples where we tried to turn things around. One was there was a specific agreement signed between the Philippines and the U.S. government, and when the details of that agreement was still being worked out, we were invited to give our input, and the first thing we pointed out is you need to make sure that the local scientist has counterpart funding. Otherwise, we will be literally carrying the baskets of our guests around and end up being research assistants rather than formal collaborators. And the Philippine government has started listening to that. The other way we try and make things work for us is, for example, just quite recently, I reached out to people in the US Embassy during a reception for Fulbright scholars. And I requested that they make sure that some of our recent work on citizen science for coral reefs be taught to the incoming batch of Peace Corps volunteers. I mentioned earlier, Peace Corps volunteers often try too many things and send the wrong messages to their host communities. Well, before they even get to that stage, we try and influence their training before they are deployed to our coastal areas. Okay, we've gotten some headway into that. If I may give one more example, there's a lot of conservation and fisheries management work being done in the Philippines that's funded by the US. In the past, these projects have often been run by Americans, many of them former Peace Corps volunteers. But lately, the heads of these projects have been Filipino scientists. And so it's a good trend. It's just that we need to act fast because we're losing our reefs very quickly. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, just on the issue of the publication journals, is there something that has been done towards including the local scientists in the review process? Because most of the work you have said it's inaccessible to the local communities. So how do we verify some of the findings and some of the, have you lobbied to the journals to include local scientists or to find ways of incorporating the communities?
Yeah, that one is difficult to break, okay? Because you will not be invited as a, let's say you're talking about a journal that's based in the UK or in the US, a high impact factor journal. You will not be invited to review manuscripts for that journal if you do not have a lot of publications to begin with. Okay, and if I want my research to be accessible to my countrymen and to be used right away, my manuscripts will be submitted to Philippine journals, but the impact factor of those journals are very low, which means that if I try to direct my work to local journals, my value as a scientist using Western metrics like H indices will be low. Okay, so other than our suggestions about what journal editors and publishers should do, there's very little we can do on our side to correct that problem.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, and Elvis for his question. And now I would like to ask Luciana Valadares, please, to open her mic and pose her question. Hi, Luciana.
Hi, thank you very much, Professor Liquanan. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Luciana from Brazil. And you mentioned that the Philippines has 182 ethnic groups and 120 languages. I would like to hear your reflections on how does parachute research and the presence of foreign researchers in the local communities impact the diversity of those ethnic groups and languages, their traditional mode of living, and their knowledge?
That's not my area of expertise, but I should say that when it comes to impacting the cultures of these groups, it's not going to be easy to distinguish the effects of local scientists and foreign scientists. So I don't think I can give you a good insight into that problem. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have one more question here from JL Angelo. JL, can you please open your mic?
Hi, good morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you guys are. It's evening here in the Philippines. I'm from where Dr. Liquanan is from. So, sir, I'd just like to ask, because you stressed the resolution of coral stressors as one of the main objectives to restoring our coral reefs. So I'm just wondering if there are technological interventions currently that we can use in tandem with that.
Most of the environmental problems in the country cannot be solved by technology. It requires behavior change. The solution to the coral reef crisis is not in the hands of scientists. We need behavior change, and so that's the first thing that must be said. But since you are interested in technological fixes, one of the things that I did not have time to talk about is some of the ways by which local science has grown significantly because of well-planned and well-executed international projects. We have very good examples of work done on coral reefs in collaboration with Australian scientists. And in many of these arrangements, there's really a lot of effort put into training the local students in Australia, but making sure their research is done in the Philippines. And so one of the latest work being tried here is you collect all the egg and sperm that the corals release, and this happens at very specific times of the year, and you make those coral larvae available to damaged reefs. And that work is done by Australian mentors and their Filipino students, and the research is done in the Philippines, mostly funded by Australia. so really good examples like that, and many of these good examples involve Australian scientists.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your answer. And now I would like to ask to Danis Cruz. Danis, can you please pose your question?
Well, mine wasn't a question. I was thinking about cultural things, because if we think about all the recommendation that a research can give to the public sector, I mean, we need to have that cultural part to be, like the professor said, it's necessary for public politics to think about that cultural issues to have a success application of recommendations. That was my comment.
Yes, and if I may, just again to give a concrete example of how things should be done. I worked with the scientists from the California Academy of Sciences for several years. And one of the features of their work here in the Philippines, aside from it being sustained and long-term, is every time they are here, they make sure that before they leave, they make presentations in local schools, to the local officials, to college students, to tell people what they're finding. And since this work often involves collaboration, we're part of these presentations. We make our own, we show them what we find, they make their own presentations, and we show them, they show them what we find. And so you're developing a rapport between the scientists and the general public.
Thank you for your intervention, Denise, and thank you for your intervention too, Professor Liquana. And I would like just to mention that Christiane put here in the chat that she recently came across this article. Christiane, do you want to talk about it personally? It would be very nice. Now?
Well, I just wanted to share it as it deals with this topic of that a renowned journal decided to adopt this attitude to not publish or to reject papers that work with data collected in Africa and that is not mentioning any African collaborator. So this is kind of an initiative, like, let's say, from the global north, that they kind of take care of this issue and that they are aware of it, and kind of, so that's, but of course that's nothing that, as the professor said, that the locals can influence in some way. This then has to come from the other side, let's say. But I found this interesting because it's in line with this, more or less, that what was mentioned in the presentation.
Yes, thank you for that link. Like I said, I've had a personal experience with this, and I actually recommended the paper be rejected, but it was published anyway. And there were no Filipino scientists in that study. In fairness to the journal editors and the reviewers, there's also another problem that is very difficult to separate. Some authors will include local scientists in the list of authors, even if the contribution of that scientist is actually not substantial enough to merit authorship. So I forgot the term. One term I've encountered is guest authorship or token authorship. And so you list one, even though that person was essentially just carrying the basket or the specimens around, and it's, you know, you cannot tell. So like I said, in fairness to the editors, it's not easy to do that. You have to try and shift the culture of the scientists that come here, influence their training, they learn the wrong things from their mentors, and those wrong things are passed on to their students.
Thank you, Professor. It was an amazing lecture, and the quality of the questions was outstanding. Thank you very much. I learned so much today. And we are now going to our break, and we are having 15 minutes break. But before going, because I am telling that because we are 10 minutes past the time, but there is no problem because we are going to catch up during the practical activity. And I would like to thank you, Professor, finally for your great lecture. And if you could share your email with the students, so the participants, so they can send you any message or any questions that were not addressed today.
Yes, I'll do that now.
Thank you. And that's it. Thank you very much for the first lecture here.